Yeah, so my name's Hannah Gibbons, and I'm going to talk to you for about an hour, hopefully, about arable plants and the Colour in the Margins project that I worked on for about 3.5 years. The project finished in October, just recently, so it's really nice to talk about it actually now that the project finished, and just kind of remind myself what we did. So it's quite a nice opportunity for me. So Back from the Brink is described as one of the most ambitious conservation projects undertaken in England. It was a really big project, lots and lots of funding, and the aim was to save 20 species from extinction and benefit over 200 more species. So it had quite big objectives. I mean, I'm not quite sure, sometimes when you do projects like this, when it only lasts for like 3 or 4 years, there's a limit as to what you can really achieve. But I do think that collectively we made quite a big impact over England. So there were 19 projects in total and 12 single species projects. So particularly down in Devon, we had the lesser butterfly orchid project and the grey long-eared bat project. So they were single species projects. And then there were also 7 integrated projects, so either covered a larger area or a habitat type. And Colour in the Margins was one of those 7 integrated projects. And so from the map there, you can see throughout England where the locations that the Back from the Brink programme focused on. And Colour in the Margins, so that was the project that I was working on. We focused on several different parts of England. I covered Devon and Cornwall, and a colleague covered Wessex, and then somebody else covered Somerset and Kent. We didn't do a huge amount of work in Yorkshire or the Brecks, but little bits and pieces of work. So that's the kind of scope that we were aiming for. So it was quite, yeah, that we had our own kind of patch almost that we were working within. And we had 10 primary plant species that we were focusing our conservation efforts upon. And these are those 10 species. And the species that I was mainly focusing upon were broad-fruited corn salad and small-flowered catchfly, and a little bit of corn buttercup. And I'll kind of talk to you about those species later. The speedwells are very, very limited in their distribution, and they're pretty much found just in the Brecks. And so that was the main work we did there. And there's very few sites with those species that are located. Interrupted brome is pretty much extinct in the wild, so we didn't do a huge amount of work on that. But the other species, we did lots of different pieces of work. So they're the different thing, the different species. And you can see that a lot of them are endangered or critically endangered. So they needed a bit of, we needed to learn more about them essentially. So the organisations that worked together on the Back from the Brink programme included Plant Life, Bat Conservation Trust, Butterfly Conservation, Bug Life, Natural England. So lots and lots of really well-established, well-known organisations working together as partners, which is a different approach from a lot of conservation work that's carried out. And lots of money. You know, it's a big project. The Heritage Lottery Fund was the main funder, but there were other different pockets of money from different other organisations too. So probably worth mentioning or talking about Arable. So when you speak to people generally, so just general public people, and you talk, when people say, what do you do for a job? And I say, work on an arable plant project. But firstly, people don't even know necessarily what arable means. So this really varies in the UK. We grow lots of different plants as crops, and that varies from cereals to maize, vegetables, and other forage crops such as forage beet and forage turnips. So arable is land used for growing crops, and 70% of the UK is farmland, and about 25% of the UK is arable. So if you think a quarter of the UK is regularly cultivated, so that's quite a significant part of the UK. So it's definitely worth thinking about, and how we can maybe incorporate more wildlife into that part of the UK. So another assumption is that arable fields are really boring and totally rubbish for wildlife, and I think even a lot of people who work in the conservation sector might make that that kind of judgment. And I know when I was working as an ecological consultant, which I did at the beginning of my career, very often, if you walked onto an arable field, you just would say it's just arable. You wouldn't even look any further than that. And so very often people make assumptions and just think it's really rubbish for wildlife. But actually, they can be incredibly good for wildlife. And I really hope that that's something that I kind of promote during this talk. So in actual fact, arable plants are our most threatened suite of plants in the UK. And so if you listed all of the plant species that we have in the UK and you put the most common species at the top and you put the most rare species at the bottom, and then you color coded them by the habitat that they like to live in, you would notice towards the bottom, the rarer species, a lot of those species tend to be associated with disturbed ground and lots of bare ground. And so they really are the most threatened suite of plants in the UK. And it is also worth noting that it's not necessarily just the UK, but this is a pattern that's happening throughout Europe. And there was a document released, I think it was in 2018, highlighting that low input arable fields are actually a red listed species, a red listed habitat almost. It's very, very threatened and provides habitat for important species. So yeah, it's a real kind of European wide issue. And in addition to arable plants being really threatened, arable land can provide habitat for a wide variety of other species. So farmland birds, pollinators and other insects. So brown hares, for example, are highly associated with mixed farms. And yeah, there's a number of species that are kind of do thrive in a mixed or arable environment. And farmland birds populations have declined by 56% since 1970. Another, depressing statistic, just to add to all the other statistics that we kind of we hear on a regular basis if we involve ourselves in the environment. And many of these species rely on arable. So the cell buntings, for example, in South Devon, they need seed sources during the winter, and a lot of the time this is provided by arable habitats. So the changes that we've made to our farming practices in the UK over the last 50 or so years have really affected a lot of species, including farmland birds. 3 other species were worked on through the project, and they are 3 species of ground beetle, and all 3 of these species have experienced some real significant contractions of their population distribution, again during the same kind of period, so in the last 50 or so years. So we did a little bit of work on ground beetles as well as the plants. I personally didn't get involved with that, however. I have absolutely no idea about anything really to do with ground beetles, other than that they really can be very useful in terms of helping reduce pests in crops. So actually attracting ground beetles to your fields, if you're an arable or mixed farmer, is actually a really good thing. So arable plant communities have been affected by changes in management, essentially. And if you look at these photographs, it kind of really shows instantly what kind of changes we've made. And we can now manage really large areas of ground very quickly and very effectively. And we have lots of chemicals that we use too. So I'm just going to talk through the changes that have happened over the last 50 or so years and how they've affected this habitat type. But firstly, so arable farming has occurred in the UK for 8,000 years. So we've been doing it here for a very, very long time. Many plant species were brought with humans as humans migrated across the planet. And many of these arable plants, so not only were they bringing the crops that they wanted to bring with them, which they needed as a food source, but they also accidentally brought weed species with them too. And in fact, some species were brought as a food crop, but now are weeds. An example of that would be fat hen. That was introduced on purpose by people when they were migrating, but we no longer see it as a food source, but we see it as a weed. And many arable plants were on the northern fringes of their distribution in the UK. So as people have migrated from warmer places, so the Mediterranean or Africa, they've brought these plants with us, or we did when we migrated. And so now these arable plants have just kind of been brought to the northern fringes of their distribution in the UK by us and our previous activities. And it's worth noting that 2 different terms for plants, archaeophytes and neophytes, and these types of plants have been brought to the UK by people and that's kind of helps kind of identify how newly they've been brought here, I suppose. And a lot of the arable plants are archaeophytes, so they've been here for a very, very long time. So in the late 1800s, we got much more efficient at cleaning our seeds. So prior to that, people would sow a crop and then they'd collect the seeds and then they'd use some of those seeds potentially to eat or something. And then some of those seeds they'd retain and then they'd sow them the next year. But that process of kind of collecting and sowing again wasn't necessarily the most efficient, and a lot of the time seeds that you wouldn't necessarily want were also collected, and so they were then sown again, and that was quite a significant issue. But in the late 1800s, technology advancement enabled seed cleaning to be much more efficient, and corn cockle and darnel, these two species on the left, corn cockle's the purple flower at the top, and darnel is a grass which is below, which looks a bit like ryegrass. These two species were described as being serious weeds in the 16th century by William Shakespeare, in fact, and now both of them are seriously close to extinction. So that shows, and both of them have quite large seeds, and so the seeds were quite similar in size to wheat or barley, and so they would have been quite difficult to pick out, and so that's why they were really very common, and now we're able to get rid of those seeds when we clean them. And in fact, corn cockle, the one at the top, that really lovely purple flower, that is considered to be native at only one location in the UK now, and that's on a plant life reserve in the east of the country. You do see it in seed mixes a lot, but those seeds would have originated from somewhere else. So from the mid-1900s onwards, we got also very, very good at making chemicals that did stuff for us, and herbicide application herbicide creation has kind of enabled us to be much better and more efficient at farming. And you'll notice this graph on the right shows the seed density, so the density of seeds in soil, and you'll notice that has been monitored since the beginning of the 1900s towards more recent decades, and the number of seeds in the soil has reduced quite dramatically over that time, and that's because we're very effective at killing plants essentially, and therefore less seeds are produced and there's less seeds in the seed bank. So that's kind of really shows how much herbicide is used, I suppose, or has done, or how much it has been used for a long time now. Essentially we're just very, very, very efficient at farming. And here's quite a nice supplement from Farmers Weekly from the early 1980s, and really just shows how, I mean, to be fair, I don't really know if things would be all that different now, but the real kind of push towards trying to eradicate the dirty dozen, for example. And here's a graph I found on the DEFRA website, which shows also how much how many pesticides have been applied on crops in the UK. And I thought this was really interesting because since 1990, which doesn't, I mean, it was quite a long time ago, but it doesn't feel like ages ago, we've almost doubled the amount of area treated by herbicides in the UK. And I think, so it's not just something that happened after the Second World War. This is something that's kind of continued to happen even in the recent decades. And in addition to herbicides, which killed the plants, were killed selectively, different species of plants, we humans have also applied lots of more fertilizer to fields. Fertilizer tends to increase the competitiveness of a crop, and also in addition to that, more competitive crop varieties are available too, and many arable plants are not very competitive, and they like open habitats, and they don't like to be shaded out, so they're also negatively affected often by fertilizer application too. Obviously, fertilizer increases yield, so you can see how we really have increased the amount we can produce since the 1940s in a given area, which is quite incredible. So other management changes that have affected arable plants is a move from spring sown crops to autumn sown crops, field enlargement and the removal of the margin habitat, minimum tillage rather than ploughing, moving from a mixed farming to grass farming, and also an increase in maize and oilseed rape production. And they tend to be very intensive, so high input, high output, lots of fertilizer and pesticide, and then they get a lot of crop as a result of that. And I'll talk about some of these in a bit more depth. So spring cultivation versus winter cultivation. Traditionally speaking, spring cultivation would have been the kind of main time when people would have ploughed up the ground and sown their seeds, like we do now. If we're going to grow vegetables, a lot of that happens in spring. And there's now been more of a move towards winter cultivation, and that's because we've got a lot more herbicides, so we can then it kind of helps the crop grow, essentially, if you kind of kill everything else out. And I suppose we've also got better cultivators, so we've got more option to go and have a winter cultivated situation rather than spring. But the thing with arable plants is they tend to either germinate in spring or autumn. So if you have a field that's been spring cultivated for hundreds of years, and then you move it to winter cultivation, a lot of the plants that grow there don't really like that change in cultivation timing, so it completely changes the conditions, and therefore changes the species that can grow in that particular field. And that's happened in the southwest quite a lot. But it's worth noting that autumn and winter cultivated crops do tend to be more intensely managed, so more herbicide is applied. Ploughing versus min tillage. Now, this is something that's really going to be quite key, I think, in the next few decades. There's a real push towards min tillage and direct drilling. Now, minimum tillage is when the surface of the ground is just scratched open, but not very deep, and so the bare ground is maintained, but the soil isn't completely turned over like it is in ploughing. And direct drilling is essentially where seeds are kind of directly stuck into the soil. And so there's different kind of cultivation techniques now. And traditionally, or at least it's quite interesting actually, because I guess traditionally, ages and ages ago, before we were even able to plough at all, I imagine a lot of the cultivation we would have been carrying out would have been very surface based. So I suppose that is quite comparable to minimum tillage. However, that would have been hundreds and hundreds of years ago when we didn't have access to herbicides. But in a min tillage system now, very often it requires a lot more herbicide application, because you get a lot of grasses and other things that maintain their status within a field, because the field isn't turned over, and so you just get growth of a lot of the more kind of aggressive weed species. So that seems to be quite detrimental to arable plants. And this photo here shows the corner of a field that was actually really diverse not that long ago, and it's been direct drilled for a number of years. So it hasn't had that regular disturbance, and as you can see, the grasses are really starting to kind of creep into the field, and it's become very, very thick, and there weren't very many plants of interest in that particular area anymore, when it was a couple of years ago. It was really, really very interesting. So I think I've pretty much said everything there. So yeah, I think it is quite early days on the long-term effects of minimum tillage, but it seems as though some species require, or some arable plant species require, more disturbance. And also, I think there's so for many species of arable plant, the seeds can last a very long time in the seed bed. So poppies, for example, have very small spherical seeds, and they're the kind of seeds that seem to last a really long time. And there's evidence to suggest that poppies last for hundreds of years in the seed bank. And other species have larger, irregular shaped seeds, and they don't seem to last as long. But those seeds that do last for a long time very often need the conditions to be anaerobic. So if the soil is turned over and they go down quite deeply, that's where there's not very much oxygen in the soil. And so that's the conditions that are needed to enable them to last for a long time. So my experience over the last few years would suggest that a lot of those plants actually need that turning over, that deep turning over the soil, to allow those seeds to reach that nice, sterile, anaerobic environment, so that they can stay there for the long term. And I suppose that's another thing about arable plants, is that
it's not necessarily the plants you can see on the surface, but it's also what's present underneath. They're a bit more like fungi in that respect, in that the main strategy for life is for a lot of them is to try and remain in the seed bank so they can make the most of those opportunities that become available. It is also worth mentioning that min tillage is a real hot topic at the moment because it prevents the soil from losing carbon. So when it comes to arable farming that involves ploughing isn't particularly beneficial when it comes to carbon sequestration in the soil. So so there's obviously a real good push for min till because it is good for carbon. I suppose my argument would be that it's kind of like doing the right thing in the right place, and some ploughing in suitable locations is actually really beneficial. It's just sometimes that farmers get rid of their ploughing kit and then they only have a min till kit, so then they can't necessarily do both types of management on the same farm. Anyway, so all of those things together have now resulted in fewer species-rich arable plant communities. And these photos, this one at the top right, for example, is a really lovely species-rich arable plant community, which is very, very uncommon now. And in addition to the fact we don't find very many species-rich communities, we also have a situation where many of the species have become rare or uncommon. Hence the reason for the project that I worked on. This map is quite an interesting one, and it comes from an arable plant book, which I'll talk about later. And it shows the best areas for arable plants in England. And disappointingly, Devon is yellow, which is less than 20 species. However, I think if we were to be completely honest, the south coast of Devon should really fall into the at least the amber 20 to 50 species area, because actually some of them, there's some really nice spots down there. So yeah, there's a real kind of central band, I suppose, mainly on the chalky soils in England, which do support the more species rich arable plant communities. So if this kind of habitat is really rare and uncommon, where would you look if you wanted to find some interesting species or species rich communities? So there are a whole host of kind of suitable management techniques, I suppose, which provides good conditions for these communities of plants. And one of these management techniques is cultivated margins and plots. This is a photo that I took in South Devon, and essentially the whole field was ploughed, then it was harrowed, and then the main part of the field was sown with the crop, and then that was managed fairly conventionally, and so herbicide and whatever was used, whatever the farmer would usually do, and this 4 metre margin was then left. So it was cultivated with the rest of the field and then left, and that was it. And this species rich community emerged, and that's just from the soil bank. And it's really interesting because the year before I'd gone to this site, because there had been historical records of a particular species there, and I found hardly anything. And luckily I persuaded the farmer just to try and put this cultivated margin in, and just to see what would happen. And I was absolutely blown away with what I saw. Not only was it beautiful to look at, but there were just tons of interesting species, and all kind of crammed in together. It was a really lovely site. And I think something I'm really passionate about, I love grasslands as well, and I really love the idea of restoring species rich grasslands. But having done that for work, when I worked for the Devon Wildlife Trust, for example, what was really clear was that actually a lot of the grassland restoration sites take years to reach something that becomes really species rich and really good for insects. But if you choose the right part of an arable field, within 6 months you can create something which is incredible and supports rare, interesting species, not necessarily rare ones, but is a really, really good site for insects and birds and mammals. And so I feel like there's almost like a gap in the market for this kind of management, but you do have to choose the right place. If you'd done this on a much more nutrient rich site, you might have got tons of thistles and nettles, which obviously isn't quite necessarily what you wanted. But yeah, choose the right place, and you really can get like instant amazing habitat. And I think that's really something that's quite key. So I think I've already described the process, And oh yeah, so in certain places, so for example in Wessex, like on Salisbury Plain, you often get these cultivated plots, which is the same, essentially the same thing, but is present within the middle of a field, and these are often provide suitable habitat, nesting habitat for stone curlew. So they don't have to be around the edge; they could be plots as well within the centre of a field. Low input crops are crops that are managed, but they either don't receive any herbicide or fertilizer, or they receive a little bit. And the cell buntings in South Devon have been brought back to life in terms of the population explosion through the RSPB work, and that's just through RSPB encouraging farmers to enter stewardship and go for low input crop options, and that just provides the lots more insects for the cell buntings to feed to their chicks during the summer, for example. So it just provides a bit of life, really. So this can be a really good way of promoting arable plant diversity. And this was taken in Cornwall, this photograph, and it was a forage beet crop, and the farmer hadn't got round to spraying it by the time I'd been. In fact, I think he might have left it that year. And there was one rare species, but this photo doesn't show any particularly rare species, but the abundance of flowers and the number of hoverflies in that field was really quite mind-blowing. And nothing's particularly uncommon, but it's just the kind of the sheer kind of abundance of everything, which was really notable, and it was quite glorious, actually. Yeah, so really very important management technique for cell buntings, for example, and that can be carried out in cereals, so like low input spring barley, for example, or root crops. Organic farms, I mean, that's something I've really noticed through the work that I was doing through Colour in the Margins, was how amazingly diverse organic arable fields were. I mean, I did only manage to go to two, both in Cornwall, but the sheer abundance and diversity of plants on these organic farms was just mind-blowing. And yeah, it was just quite incredible, so different. So this particular farm, this farmer, he manages his arable as a whole crop silage. So he'll sow, usually he sows barley and peas. So you can see a pea plant right at the front of the photograph. And the barley, to be fair, is kind of like swamped by the cornsbury, which is all of this white flowered plant. And cornsbury is a vulnerable species, and it's a species you do tend to find in Devon and Cornwall fairly regularly, but nationally it's classed as vulnerable. And as you can see, there's so much cornsbury in that field, you can kind of barely see anything else. So he would sow peas and spring barley, and then he harvests the crop before the seeds ripen, and then he'll kind of use that as a silage which he feeds to his cows. But at the same time, he makes sure that there's a strip of uncut vegetation around the edge, so it allows the plants to set seed, because if he takes it too early, then the main bulk of it can't set seed, which for the long term might not be that great for the centre of the field, but it will maintain the population around the edge of the field. So yeah, that's kind of like a starry sky of cornsbury. Yeah, so some of the best arable plant assemblages I came across were found on organic farms, particularly organic farms that have been organic for a long period of time. So cereal headlands, this is another means of promoting arable plant growth, and this is a part of a crop. So you would cultivate, so you'd plough, and then sow the crop over the whole field, and then you would leave a strip or a corner unsprayed with herbicide. So you have wildflowers growing in amongst your crop. And interestingly, this purple flower here, this is all marsh woundwort, and it's a plant I would never have associated with arable fields, but for some reason, at least in Devon and Cornwall, it really quite likes growing in arable fields, and it was a species I came across quite regularly. This field, the margin was left unharvested, but some cereal headlands are harvested with the rest of the crop. So you can either leave it unharvested and then leave the seeds for birds over winter, or you could potentially harvest the cereal headland along with the cereal field, which occurs on the main part of the field. Yeah, and corn buntings really do appreciate that management. Corn buntings we have on the north coast of Cornwall. We don't have any in Devon as far as I'm aware, but cereal headlands are a really good management technique for corn buntings because they're a ground nesting bird species. And really, probably the main place that I found interesting species were in field corners and field margins. That's largely because you have like an edge effect. And it's also places where the spray boom can't necessarily get to. So they're just awkward little spots where herbicide just happens to kind of not get to. And I guess that tends to happen on a regular basis, which allows that field corner to build up a slightly more diverse and slightly more abundant arable plant assemblage. And in this photograph, we've got some maize in the background, and maize is tends to be really high input, lots and lots of chemicals, fertilizers and herbicides, and so you don't necessarily associate maize fields with interesting arable plant assemblages. But this little patch of plants here was a really lovely little spot. There's a western ramping Fuma tree plant, which is this white little kind of flower head collection of flowers here, and we've got lots of scarlet pimpernel, marsh woundwort again making an appearance, and some field madder, this tiny little pink flowers at the front of the photograph. So a really nice little pocket of interesting species just in a field corner. And on conventional farms, which to be fair is the vast majority of mixed and arable farms, it's definitely the best place to look. So if you happen to follow a footpath that goes along at the edge of an arable field, then keep your eyes peeled. You might see something exciting. So arable plant communities, or looking in arable fields, is really quite exciting. It's a bit of a treasure trove. You never really know what you might find. And that's because the vegetation community very often changes from one year to the next, and that's largely because the species that grow in any given year are dependent upon the weather conditions. So the timing of like frosts, when things might germinate, and also the cultivation timing. So for sometimes you might have a quite wet summer, in which case the fields are cultivated a bit later, or it might be that it's a very dry, warm spring, in which case the fields are cultivated earlier. So those two things very often make quite a difference in terms of the plant species you might find, and that's also followed by cultivation depth. So if you did a deep plough one year, then you might bring some species up that might not have been exposed for a while, so that also makes a difference. The soil type, which I'll talk about later, really makes a huge difference as to what species you might find. In addition, the historical management will also create some kind of difference in terms of what's present. So this is the same photo that I talked about earlier, the photo from South Devon, and this is the same field margin in 2 separate years. The top photograph was taken following an autumn cultivation, and poppies really love autumn cultivation, so they like being sown in autumn, and this photo to the right at the bottom was taken after a spring cultivation, and you can see I can't see any poppies in that photograph. There may have been a couple, but it's very, very different. So you can really see how the vegetation can change in one place from one year to the next, just depending on minor things such as the cultivation timing and the conditions weather-wise. So other considerations that's worth kind of mentioning. Firstly, arable plants are completely undersurveyed. So we know more information, and I think a lot of the species that are uncommon are definitely uncommon, but it might be that you could find some quite interesting things if you went and looked out in your local area. They're very often the rarest thing on the farm, and also unfortunately very often the hardest sell really. Very often, I mean, some of them look really beautiful when you get up close, but when you're trying to show to a farmer like how amazing that they've got something really cool on their farm, it's often a bit kind of underwhelming for them, I think. And if you're trying to, I don't know, if you're involved in dormouse conservation or something, it's a bit more interesting. So very often they're completely overlooked, but they very much are often the rarest thing on the farm. Long-term arable is a really good place to look. So if a field's been arable for a long time, that kind of might make you think that could be a good place. South facing slopes tend to be quite good because a bit warmer. If you remember that a lot of the arable plants evolved somewhere slightly warmer than here. The top of the slope, if the field's on a slight slope, can be a good place to look because soil slowly slumps over time, particularly when it's cultivated, and so the soil becomes a bit thinner and it has slightly less nutrients at the top of the slope. So that sometimes can make a bit of a difference. And I've mentioned already that margins and field corners and gateways can be quite good for arable plants, but also things that are in the middle of the field which create an obstruction. So telegraph poles or I don't know, other features that the farmer has to kind of plough around. They can be good places to look as well. So very often arable fields, not very often, but sometimes arable fields have grass margins around the outside. So they're just a strip of grass that's left as grass for a number of years. And that can be really good because it provides kind of tusky grass for invertebrates and small mammals. But also sometimes there's some really, really good seeds under there. So actually rotating the grass margins and cultivating them sometimes can be really good because you could get some really interesting species come up. So I'll just talk about the different soil types that we have and the species that you might associate with those. So plants of calcareous soils. This is a species called Viper's bugloss, which I found a couple of times in the southwest, but not much, largely because it tends to be associated with calcareous or chalky soils. So as a part of the Colour in the Margins project, the areas with calcareous or chalky soils that we worked in were Wessex, Kent, a little bit in Yorkshire, and also a little bit in the Cotswolds, actually, which is an additional piece of work that we carried out. And the species that you find in calcareous soils are actually species that I haven't really come across all that much in Devon and Cornwall. So pheasant's eye is a real lovely species. It's a red coloured buttercup, and that is a species that's actually looking quite sad at the moment in terms of its distribution and abundance. Red hemp nettle and spreading hedge parsley, all of these three were species that we worked on, but obviously not in Devon and Cornwall. Shepherd's needle, that's another species that I don't really come across all that much. In South Devon, we do have examples of dwarf spurge and night flowering catchfly, and also stinking chamomile and rye brome. But again, you don't necessarily find them very, very regularly. So it's quite a different suite of species. Plants of clay soils. So one of the species that you associate with clay soils is this, which is the corn buttercup, which I've already talked about. And another name for corn buttercup is devil's claw, because if you see these are the seed pods, and they're really big. They're probably about 1 centimetre long, and they have these real kind of spiky appendages on, and they're really very, very distinctive. And that's a species that is highly associated with clay soils. And it's quite a nice one to see. So we did a bit of work in the Somerset. That was quite a clayey area that we worked in, and some additional areas, Worcester and Cambridge, so out of our kind of initial focus areas. And some additional species that quite like living in clayey soils are mousetail and spreading hedge parsley. And I've never seen mousetail before, so I can't really tell you much about that, but spreading hedge parsley is quite a nice one. And my colleague and friend did a lot of work on that particular species. Again, it's quite an underwhelming one. It's not too exciting to look at. So the species that I kind of largely became familiar with over my time are the species that tend to be associated with sandy and shale soils. As in Devon and Cornwall, the vast majority of arable farming is carried out on these soil types. So the Brex is also very sandy, and then obviously down in Devon and Cornwall. And these are the species that are highly associated with that kind of soil type, particularly corn marigold, field madder, field woundwort. I would say those three species are, together with the cornsbury, the one that looked a bit like a starry sky, Those four species together are a real kind of classic sandy soil assemblage, really, and they are fairly common, not exceptionally uncommon. But if you start seeing those species together, you know, it's worth keeping your eyes peeled for something slightly more exciting. And I'll talk about some of these additional species in a second. So Fuma trees are a really weird and cool group of plants. They look quite similar, so these are four different species, but you can see that they're definitely related. But I think I love them because they're just so strange looking, and I think also I like them because they're slightly challenging to identify as well. And they are, despite looking very similar, they have lovely little kind of key characteristics which help you separate them. Both white ramping Fuma tree and western ramping Fuma tree are quite large. And western ramping Fuma tree has this lovely white hood which kind of goes over the top of the flower, and that is not white, but it's purple in the white ramping Fuma tree. It's worth noting actually that in addition to ramping Fuma trees, we also have Fuma trees. In the southwest, we tend to have more ramping Fuma trees and less Fuma trees, and in the east of the country, we tend to have more Fuma trees and less ramping Fuma trees. And the question is, how do you tell them apart? So the main the key kind of ID feature is that you measure the length of the flower from the end of the spur, so the rear end of the flower, all the way to the top, but you exclude the bottom lip. So it's to the front of the flower, excluding that bottom lip. And that length there is the main indicator. If the length is 9 millimeters or more, then you're looking at a ramping Fuma tree. If it's less than 9 millimeters, you're looking at a Fuma tree. And other than that, they do look fairly similar. But yeah, they're quite a cool array of species. And if you're going to go out and about having a look at these, the common ramping Fuma trees is definitely the most common species that you'll find, though not to say that you won't find the others, except for western ramping Fuma tree is most certainly a Cornish species, and it's endemic to Cornwall. So there are no records of that species in Devon or anywhere else in the world, for that example, for that instance. We've got lots and lots of daisies that grow in the sandy and shaly soils of Devon and Cornwall. So I've already talked a bit about corn marigold, really lovely golden flower. It's got really glaucous grey waxy leaves, which I'll probably talk about later. So really very, very distinctive species. We've got cornflower, which gives us, you know, our classic cornflower blue colour that people are familiar with. This species has reduced in abundance and distribution really significantly over the last few decades, and it's a species you just don't see so much nowadays. And yeah, so that's quite, well, worrying in some respects. And then you have kind of more of a classic daisy. So these two species, which are the slightly less common, stinking chamomile, which is really an interesting species, and it smells a bit gross, and it smells a bit like sick. And I remember my manager for this project, we went to a site together, and she was like, oh, it just smells really sickly and it's quite gross. And I was like, when we first turned up, I was like, oh, it's not too bad. By the end of the day, oh my God, it was actually really vile. So it's a kind of sick smell that kind of grows on you in a bad way. So that's stinking chamomile. And there's corn chamomile, which I've never actually seen before. But to separate them out, so say if you took this yellow capitulum, this central section of the flower, and you picked it apart, you would notice that there are these florets. But in addition to that, and these florets actually turn into seeds eventually, but in addition to that, you have these little scales, and the shape of the scale separates out these two species. So stinking chamomile has a linear scale, and corn chamomile has a scale that has shoulders. So they're quite, and also corn chamomile doesn't smell like sick either. So there's a few you know, features that can help distinguish those two species from one another. And scented mayweed and scentless mayweed, and these are by far the most common of the daisy lookalikes that you'll find in an arable field, nationally, I should imagine, not just down in the southwest. These species, you'll notice, haven't got any scales. That's because if you pick apart the capitulum, all you'll find is a floret, and that's all. You won't find anything else. And the florets between the two species are very, very different. These have got kind of long linear ridges, and the scentless mayweed almost looks like the ghost of an owl. That's kind of or just a ghost of some description. And it has these two kind of glands, which make it look like it's got eyes. In fact, I don't know what the glands are for. I guess it might be something to do with attracting insects or maybe deterring insects. I'm not sure. So they're quite easily identifiable. And also, in addition to that, if you split the capitulum in half, for scented mayweed, you'll find that it's hollow. Wherefore, for scentless mayweed, you'll find that it's solid. So there's two things here, two additional things that help separate those two species out. Scentless mayweed isn't scentless, but it doesn't smell quite so strongly and pleasant as scented. Two of my other little favourites, these are the Fluelens. Not only do they look cool, but they've got cool Latin names, Kixiaspuria and Kixiaspuria. These are so cute. They're like little toad flaxes or little snapdragons, and in fact, if you do squeeze their little cheeks together, they do snap, so they're quite sweet. And the flower heads are probably about, I don't know, less than a centimetre long, so they're really quite small. So you've got two species, round leaf Fluellen and sharp leaf Fluellen, and when they're mature, the leaves like to follow that pattern. So the round leaves, round-leaved has round leaves, and the sharp-leaved has sharp spiky bits to the base of the leaf. Sometimes when the plant is young, though, they can be a little bit mixy in terms of the sharp-leaved doesn't necessarily have the spiky bits. But generally speaking, the round-leaved is much hairier and is more stout. You can see that it's got a real kind of stout growth, wherefore the sharp-leaved tends to really kind of trail around, and you can see it's got its stem is kind of just trailing around through the vegetation. And then in addition to that, there are a couple of other things that are key features between the two. Round-leaf Fluellen has a hairy flower stem, and sharp-leaf Fluellen, as an example, this photo is an example in the middle, has a hairless flower stem. And round leaf Fluellen tends to have a really dark purple. This is quite a dark purple, but this is sharp leaved and it's actually a bit paler than the round leaved. It's almost like a black purple. The round leaved Fluellen has that kind of black purple kind of coloration to the top of the flower. So they're really lovely. And you know, if you poke around any arable fields in Devon, you're fairly likely to come across these two species, sharp leaved more so than round leaved. Two other really lovely plants, two species in the toad flax family, and that's small toad flax and Weasel Snout. Weasel Snout's probably got one of the coolest names of a plant, I would say, in the UK. And if you look really closely at the small toad flax plant, you'll notice that the little hairs on the leaves are actually glandular, so they're gland tipped. And Weasel Snout is not obviously gland tipped, especially when it's mature. But I suppose they're similar-ish in flower structure, and the leaves are similar, but Weasel Snout is much larger and has a slightly more spiky appearance to it, actually, which I think you can make out from those photographs. It's quite nice to see them in the same place, actually. If you see them together, it's quite a nice thing. So the species that I was working specifically on in Devon and Cornwall I'll talk about now. So small flowered catchfly, Silene gallica, is a member of the campion family. And again, this species has glandular hairs too. And you can kind of just about make out some of these hairs have got glandular tips to them. And that gives this plant and other catchflies the name catchfly. And you'll notice that there's actually some dead flies that are attached onto this plant. And it often kind of they get stuck on, or you might get thistle down or other things kind of stuck to it. So that gives the catchfly its name. And this photograph on the right, or this image on the right, shows you the national distribution of this species. And you'll notice that the paler dots are the older records and the darker dots are the more recent records. So you can really show how the that map really shows how the distribution has kind of constricted over the recent decades. And this image zooms into Devon and Cornwall. And again, you can see that the distribution in Devon, for example, well, mainly, has has really restricted over the last few decades, and now it's much more of a coastal species. Broad-fruited corn salad. This is possibly the hardest sell in terms of trying to encourage people to love it. And just to kind of put it into some kind of context, each one of those seeds is about the size of a grape pip. So it's quite a small plant. And it's quite sprawling. So it doesn't, I mean, it looks quite beautiful when you look up close, but from a distance, particularly if you're standing, it's really, it is not a very showy offy plant. So this is in the corn salad family. There are 5 different species of corn salad. This is the rarest of the 5. And what makes it identifiable is the size and shape of these seed pods, and the fact that they're inflated and they look a bit like grape pips kind of identify it as broad-fruited corn salad. The others have a slightly weirder, kind of very often more narrow shape, but each species has a seed that's a different shape. So they are quite easy to identify. However, not necessarily during the flowering stage. You need to kind of visit those plants during when they're in seed. And this species has a much more restricted distribution, as you can see from that map. And in Devon and Cornwall, again, there has been a real loss of much of the population. In fact, since the year 2000, well, no, sorry, in the last decade, since 2010, there's only 2 records of that species in Devon and Cornwall. And unfortunately, this species, which is near Dartmoor, was actually never probably accurate. And I'm not sure, I probably should know actually, about where that species, where that record is from East Devon. But yeah, we've got a real kind of constriction of distribution now. And the third species I'll talk about is corn buttercup. So this is the devil's claw. It's got more of a slightly southeasterly distribution in the UK. And in Devon and Cornwall, again, we've seen quite a significant decline in distribution. And there's one site on the border between Devon and Cornwall and one site on the edge of Dartmoor, actually, which the site on the edge of Dartmoor does still exist. But the site on the edge of between Devon and Cornwall isn't necessarily still there, but the landowners, National Trust, are looking to try and reinstate it. So what did I actually get up to? So I wandered around a lot of fields, and those sites were selected by looking at, we got lots of the old historical records of those 3 species. Well, in Devon and Cornwall, that's what I did. So we approached the Botanical Society of the British Isles, and we asked them for all of the historical records of those 3 species. And then we tried to contact as many of those farms as possible. And we kind of worked backwards. We kind of tried to go to the sites with the most recent records and then try and work our way back. And my aim really was to try and visit as many of those farms as possible over the course of 3 years. And I worked 2.5 days a week. So it was quite limited in terms of how much time I could put to it. But in the first 3 years, so from 2018 to 2020, I visited 60 different holdings in Devon and Cornwall, but many of those holdings have multiple visits, and several of them, in fact, a good number of them, I went to in each of the 3 years, and that was shows the distribution of the sites that I visited, and so most of them were along the coast, essentially in South Devon and North Cornwall. So of the 60 holdings I visited, only 20 supported primary species that I was going to go and see. So 2/3 of the sites didn't have the species that I was expecting to find, or at least hoping to find. And that kind of doesn't sound too bad, apart from the fact that the outcomes really were that small-flowered catchfly, so the sites I found small-flowered catchfly are highlighted in orange, that kind of shows that that species isn't actually doing as bad as it could be. Though there's literally one corn buttercup farm in Devon and Cornwall, or one corn buttercup site where the plant has been recorded, at least during the length of the project that I was working on, and 2 farms supported broad-fruited corn salad, one in Devon and one in Cornwall. So those species really aren't looking so hot, but the small-flowered catchfly isn't actually doing too badly. which I suppose is pretty good news. So after I visited all of the farms, I put together a specific report for that farm, including information on the species. But most importantly, I think for the farmer, we provided maps of their farm. We highlighted which fields were of county and national importance for arable plants. So the fields in yellow for this particular farm were of county importance, and the orange was national importance for arable plants. The green field was just a field that I highlighted because it was in grass. And this farm didn't support any fields that were of European importance for arable plants because that was highlighted as a red polygon. So we kind of provided management advice, and we also told them what we found in each field. So we got really positive feedback from the farmers, and they found those maps really useful. So that was good. In addition to going to visit historical sites, we also carried out some reintroductions. And this work was carried out with the Kew Millennium Seed Bank. They provided us with seeds, and these seeds were had a local origin. We didn't want to bring seeds in from other places, and they worked really, like the Kew Millennium Seed Bank were really good. They collected we collected seeds for them, they grew them on for us and gave us more seeds back, and they also looked after seeds for us in really good conditions that we'd collected and then gave them back as well. So we had a really nice relationship with those guys. We did loads and loads of reintroductions on National Trust land, some other work at Dawlish Warren Countryside Park, for example. We worked with the RSPB on some of their reserves, and also lots and lots of private land holdings as well. Many of the landowners were really keen to get involved, so that was really good. So reintroduction wise, between 2019 and 2020, I reintroduced small flowered catchfly to 22 fields on 12 holdings, which included the sowing of 300,000 seeds. And we sowed approximately 100 seeds per square metre. So we followed a specific methodology so that the results could, in theory, be compared between sites, and also if anybody was wanting to reproduce doing that thing again, go through the process again, they would know exactly what to do. So we were very specific in the methodology that we carried out. And then in 2021, the project was extended, and so I was able to carry out some more reintroductions. So that happened at another 19 fields and 14 holdings and another 300,000 seeds. So there was quite a lot of work on the small flowered catchfly in terms of reintroductions. Broad-fruited corn salad was a little bit not so easy because I had a really limited amount of seeds available, and these seeds were collected from the site in South Devon where the population was doing quite well, but I didn't want to collect too many seeds, so I was kind of limited as to how much reintroduction I could do of that species. So I put a small number of seeds out at 2 sites in South Devon. One was the site next door to, or the farm next door to the the original population, and then I also sowed some seeds in Cornwall as well. So results wise, the broad fruited corn salad was a bit mixed, particularly in South Devon, which is really unfortunate, but I feel like it's kind of really taught me a bit of a lesson really. So in the first year following the reintroduction, I got quite small numbers of plants, so 5 at one site and 1 at the other site. But in the second year following the reintroduction, I didn't find anything. And I think the reason for this was I put out such a few number of seeds. I think I put out about 2,500 seeds at each site. And I think perhaps I would need to put more seeds out, or maybe put seeds out in successive years to try and build the population a bit. So it might be that those species might start to kind of re-emerge, but it's not looking particularly great for those reintroductions. The site in North Cornwall, however, is looking quite good because the first year after I sowed those seeds, I got 90 plants. So that's looking like a really healthy population. So I'm hoping that will be successful in the long run. And in terms of small flower catchfly, that was really successful. So this is just the results from the 2020 survey. And as you can see, the number of plants that I found at each site really varied from thousands to hundreds. But generally speaking, reintroducing small flowered catchfly is a lot easier. But also bearing in mind that I generally sowed about 20,000 seeds per site for that species. So I think that made a significant difference too. There's one site down in Exeter at Powder and Marshes, not in the wet marshes bit, but on a drier area where it wasn't successful. And I think that's because that plant community is pretty much dominated by corn marigold. And as I mentioned earlier, it has really waxy leaves. And I think that kind of thick, waxy leaf really reduces the amount of light that reaches the ground. And it's quite a competitive plant. And I think actually small flower catchfly doesn't really like growing in that environment. So I think that's why that particular one wasn't successful. So again, you know, it's helped us pick up information, I suppose, as to what those plants really like and what they don't like. And that information that we gathered, along with other anecdotal pieces of information, has helped us put together really detailed ecology and conservation portfolios for each of the 10 species that we've been working on. And these documents are really they've got a lot of good information in them. So if you're interested, I'll show you a link in a little while as to where you can find that info from. So yeah, some really readable yet detailed documents about the species that we worked on. So if anybody continues that work in the future, they'll have a good starting point. And something I probably should have mentioned more towards the beginning of the presentation, but what is the difference between a weed and a plant, essentially? Like what becomes an arable weed and what becomes an arable plant? And I remember when I went for my RSPB interview, I referred to arable plants as arable weeds. And I mean, I didn't get told off, but I was corrected. So essentially, weeds are plants or problem plants which tend to be quite aggressive in growth. So blackgrass, barren brome, thistles, sow thistles, you know, they're quite aggressive species, and they tend to dominate, and they are actually really problematic when it comes to growing crops. Wherefore arable plants don't tend to be as aggressive at all, and they tend to be quite low growing, and there's a reason as to why a lot of them are no longer common, and that's because they're just quite easy to get rid of. Wherefore the weeds, the problem weeds, are obviously way more difficult to get rid of, and that's why they're still around in a lot of arable fields. And if you're interested in learning a bit more about arable plants and how the management of arable plants and arable weeds kind of mixes with crop growing, there's a really good talk which is called Making Peace with the Weeds by Chloe Mclaren, and she gave this talk at the Real Oxford Farming Conference in 2020, and highlights something which I thought was really interesting, in that if you have a small low growing arable plant community in amongst your crop, it doesn't negatively affect the productivity of that crop at all. And actually when you start spraying things with herbicide, you end up actively selecting for the weeds that are really aggressive, and so you're kind of eventually making your problem harder to deal with, because you're kind of like putting that selection pressure on the weeds. So that was a really interesting talk, and it's only, it's 15-16 minutes long, so it's really worth having a look at if you're interested in that kind of thing. So I've just got a couple of slides left about some useful resources that you might be interested in looking at. Our Colour in the Margins website has got loads and loads of information on it. The most useful bits of info probably are the crib sheets. So each of the groups of plants have got their own crib sheet, and it helps you identify the different species within that group. So we've got buttercups, how to identify the different buttercups in arable fields, the different carrots, so the spreading hedge parsley from different other species of hedge parsley, how to identify the different corn salads, pansies. So these are really useful documents, and there's a whole load of other stuff. We've even got cross-stitch designs, which I think is pretty crazy, but there's loads of info. So this is an example of the field pansy and the wild pansy crib, and how you'd separate out those two species from each other So lots and lots of really useful information on that website. There's also the Plant Life website, which has lots of arable plant information. The Farm Wildlife website is also really, really good. We've got, well, not we, but there is a rare arable flowers app, so you can have it on your phone, and that might help you identify plants when you're out and about, and that's free to download too. The Arable Plants, a Field Guide is a really good book. It gives you a really nice introduction as to how we've changed the landscape, and right from the beginning of humans starting to farm. So it tells you the real nice story of arable farming, and it's also got a detailed page for a lot of the rarer arable species. So that's also quite good for identification too. So that's a great book, and it's written by Phil Wilson, who's an excellent arable plant specialist who lives in East Devon. He's like the oracle of all arable plant knowledge. And if you're really keen, you can also join our arable seed swap group. This provides opportunities for people to send seeds to each other, and so you can grow different species of rare arable plant, and then you can get to know that species, and then you can collect the seeds and then share them with other people. And so I'm probably growing, I don't know, probably about 10 or 20 different arable plant species from one year to the next, and I share those seeds with other people, and people are just sharing stuff. So that's really nice too. So feel free to join that group if you would like. And that is it. Hopefully I've not been talking to myself for the last hour.
You haven't. No, absolutely not. Thank you so much. That was excellent. Very comprehensive. Thank you so much. What I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is I'll go into your presentation, and I'll put the resources you just highlighted up into our newsletter, so that our members can actually access them easily. And of course, we are recording your talk, and that'll be up on the Devon Wildlife Trust YouTube channel, and obviously they'll be able to get the information from there as well, but there'll be two ways to get the information out there. So we turn to John, who has been hopefully collating questions from our members. If anyone has any questions, please continue to send them through to John on the digital messenger, and he'll put them to Hannah. John.
Thanks, Simon. That's good. Let's fire away with a few questions here. One from PF Joyce here to start the ball rolling. Is there some growing recognition that for farmers, the costs of herbicide, pesticides and fertilizers outweigh any apparent gain in productivity, therefore less profit? How did the conversations go on that?
Mixed, I suppose. I think generally speaking, not really. I think a lot of farmers, I mean, this is very difficult to kind of put everybody into one group, but I think a lot of the farmers I met aren't necessarily the most savvy business people. Mm-hmm. And I still think there's a real push looking at looking at productivity and turnover rather than really focusing on profit. So I think generally speaking that would be good if people did start to think about that a little bit more. And I'm guessing that perhaps when the new ELMS scheme kicks off, the new environmental land management scheme kicks off in 2024, I wonder if that might make a difference. But yeah, some farmers were really up for trying stuff, and others weren't so much. It kind of just really varied on the individual. But I think very often, particularly for the arable plant side of things, because it's such a transitory habitat, you can try something for a year and see what happens. Mm-hmm. And then, so sometimes it can be successful. Other times it might be that you just get a bit too many thistles come up and you're like, okay, well, that's not a great place. You could try somewhere else. So I think the transitory nature of arable management is beneficial, and it allows people to try stuff. Wherefore, when people are grassland farmers, they don't necessarily, you don't see change quite so fast.
Yeah. So you can mix and match. You can try things out. Yeah. Okay. Linda, is minimum till thought to preserve soil structure and therefore earthworm population levels better than ploughing?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for soil health and for carbon, Min Till is better and direct drilling is better. And I think there will be I think as time goes on, there'll be more of a push for farmers to kind of carry out arable farming through those techniques. But if that is only carried out, then we will lose, even more of this kind of habitat, the arable plant habitat, all the more diverse communities. So I think what would be really good is just having the right kind of thing in the right place, really, and just choosing the management that's most suitable. So, if you have a well-known that species-rich arable plant community, trying to maintain that for the longer term would be, good for all those reasons that I've kind of talked about.
Yeah. I think you probably answered this one. I assume that you've had lots of experience negotiating with farmers. How easy was it to convince them of the value of these weeds?
Yeah, I mean, it was difficult because, like I say, a lot of them aren't very showy, and also it's a plant, and plants tend to be a bit harder anyway. They're not fluffy. When they're small and not very showy, makes life a bit more difficult. But I think more often than not, I mean, I think it's difficult to tell because it was only a 3-year project. Like I had lots of farmers so one farm particularly I can think of, they had a B&B, and without me even realizing, they'd put this big kind of like bit of text about how they loved their farm and how it's really important for arable plants and how they really loved that. And so I think for those guys, like, it was something they really started to appreciate.
Yeah.
But that was when I was contacting them regularly and having quite a lot of input into what they were doing. But now that the project's finished and there's nobody to provide them with that kind of like regular contact and almost reminding people that it's important, then in 10 years time or 5 years time, it's difficult to say really. But I think some people have kind of like feel like they've learned something and appreciate something new on their farm.
Yeah. Simon Hickey, how do you clean seeds?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I mean, I guess originally it would have been with like riddles or sieves, because you have lots of seeds of different sizes. And I imagine that's probably how they would do it now, but way more technical. So some farms, so I went to a farm in South Devon near Kingsbridge, and they were a farm that sold their seed as seed for somebody else. So they had to have their crop incredibly clean. So they put a huge amount of herbicide on their fields, and it was literally just crop and nothing else. So I suppose now using a lot of herbicide kind of reduces the seed cleaning need at the end. But I imagine it's a selection of different kind of sieves and things like that. But it's mechanical anyway, as far as I can tell.
Right. Okay. Do preserved margins need to be interconnected to promote species spread?
That's an interesting question, because actually a lot of arable plants kind of tend to be found in the same locations. So they don't necessarily tend to move very quickly, but that obviously depends on the species. So for example, spreading hedge parsley has got hooked spines on the seed. So that would be a species that probably is more mobile because it would attach to passing animals and things. But some species, so small flowered catchfly, for example, it's just like, it's the campion. And so it's just kind of got the seeds in a little cup, and then the wind kind of blows it and the cup empties on the floor. So they don't tend to move very far. Right. But very often, if you visit the same field over and over again, many of the species tend to be in the same location. So, and also I guess that they would probably move by ploughing. So if you plough in the same direction every year, for example, you're moving the soil along a wee bit more each year. So you're just kind of slowly spreading them. So the connectivity, I think, is probably better for the more mobile species, but that would use the margins, for example, and would slowly benefit the arable plants, but it wouldn't happen very quickly, the spread.
Okay, you've preempted the next one. Which wildflower identification app do you recommend? You've already given us that. So
yeah, that app's quite good. I think I would probably go with a book if I was going to go outside and identify them. But I really do think that the cribs that we put together for colour in the margins is really, really good, because it just kind of like gets rid of the extra info almost. It just puts out the species that are going to be associated with disturbed habitats. And so it kind of makes life a bit easier than when you've got a whole book and you're not quite sure where to start. So those cribs online are really good.
Okay, that's useful. PF says, are all these annuals? If so, I suppose there's unlikely to be any role for can't read that. Mycorrhizal, yeah, links between plants.
Yeah, they are mostly annuals, and that is definitely something I should have mentioned. And also because of the kind of regular disturbance, you don't tend to get good mycorrhizal growth. So yeah, I don't, as far as I'm aware, that's quite correct.
Okay. Andrew Smearden, how can we incentivize spring sowing of cereals to help favour arable plants and also overwintering bird populations?
I think probably good payment rates in agri-environment schemes is probably the best thing. I think also people just acknowledging or even knowing that arable provides really, additional habitat that's really good for wildlife. I mean, I think, the fact that a lot of conservationists don't even value arable habitats or mixed habitats kind of really shows that there is kind of just a lack of knowledge almost. So, increasing knowledge, but also good payment rates would probably incentivize people to do it.
How much detail do we know about the new incentive scheme? Is there any detail, or is it very broad brush at the moment?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, there's very little information that's come out as yet. Yeah, I don't know.
So in the next 3 years, they've basically got to develop detailed tables, I guess, for incentives. And
I mean, I imagine it'll probably be very similar. The options, I imagine, would be fairly similar to what's available now. I mean, I guess how you measure the success of those options and the payment rates might be slightly different. But I imagine that for arable anyway, like cultivated margins and cereal headlands and birdseed mixes and things like that will probably be fairly similar to what they are now.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Okay, that's all the questions, unless anybody else has got one. No, I think that's it. So back to you, Simon.
Brilliant. Well, Hannah, thank you very much indeed for an excellent talk, and very, very informative. And I must admit, I hadn't really realised what it was I was stomping over when I would try and not walk in the crops. So perhaps I should walk in the crops for preference rather than walk on the margins. But thanks very much indeed, and you obviously know your stuff and have increased our knowledge greatly, and I hope that we'll be able to spread the message out, as I say, through the YouTube recording, but also we'll put things out in our newsletter. But thank you so much indeed, and we'll let you
No worries. Cheers.